So, today we're continuing on in chapter 3. We're in verses 6 through 9 last week, and we're just rolling on through verse 10 to 14 today. Bit of some confluence in what we saw last week. A thematic shift where he's going to be kind of roping in other concepts, one particularly. He continues, that is the Apostle Paul continues to quote from the Old Testament here. We saw that last week as well. And by virtue of what he's talking about and what he's addressing, a lot of what we're going to be looking at today is quite philosophically heavy. A heavy amount of symbolic meaning and value kind of works its way through this. And we've talked about those kind of things before, but it comes up again here, right? Where the symbolism of certain events or other such things that feature in these ancient literatures become pertinent in what he's writing about here, and then kind of transfer their understanding of meaning through to us. So part of it you probably will have heard me talk about before, at least in some respects. During Easter, last Easter 2024, part of this imagery came up. So there'll be some familiarity if you were there during Holy Week. But much of it will probably be new to you, not new to Christianity, but new to you, right? Which is good, because that's part of learning. So, as normal, we'll read and then we'll go from there, right? So, Galatians chapter 3, verses 10 to 14. For as many as are the works of the law, For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law to do them." Now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident, for, quote, "the righteous shall live by faith." However, the law is not of faith, rather, he who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree," in order that in Christ Jesus, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, the nations, so that we would receive the promise of the Holy Spirit through faith. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all Holy Scripture to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope that is in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, there's a couple of quotes there, and mostly, hopefully your English translations have the words in quotation marks, right? There's three primary quotations that come in verse 10, verse 11, and, one of it's also a half, but I suppose it's technically four, but verse 10, verse 11, through to verse 12, and then again in verse 14, right? We're going to make reference obviously to where those are, at least the major ones, and then primarily we're really actually going to be focusing quite heavily on the last of those quotations that's there in the end of verse 13. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Part of it is understanding what it originally meant, part of it is understanding what it meant in the context of what Paul's writing here, centuries after those original quotes, and then how we can understand that all together, right? So, verse 10. For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse, the many referring to people, right? Keep in mind that last week what we saw in verse 6 through 9 was much to do with the reality of the righteous, or those who are justified before God, those who are made right with God coming by faith, and not ultimately by moral standing, right? Works of the law is how he refers to it, right? The moral law that is a part of life, that is a very part of the framework of the cosmos. This moral law that is a part or above from the laws of men, which we make, rightfully so, that stands as a judge above us all, right? The law is that which we know inwardly. It's that which our conscience testifies to. It's why we don't have to, spend arduous amounts of time raising our children to specifically know that murder is wrong, right? To use the most extreme of examples, okay? no matter how far we run in attempting to deny or suppress or to ignore in various different aspects our own conscience, it nevertheless still remains there. It's part of who we are. That is by design. That is the essence of the law, and every other law that comes from that is ultimately founded in that basic kind of part of the human experience, as it were. In this case, he's saying that as many as are of the works of the law, in other words, do them and perform them in order to attain righteousness, attain glory, attain etc., are under a curse, right? And so this concept of curse is going to be a main portion or a major portion of what we're looking at, especially because that word gets repeated again later on, right? But a curse in this context is not necessarily the kind of hocus pocus as we'd imagine it in the modern Hollywood type sense. The curse is that of judgment, right? It's a judgment that comes upon one, okay? Which is historically what that term has meant. It is obviously negative in connotation for obvious reasons, but it is a judgment, right? You are cursed under that by virtue of the fact that, as he's partly been explained on already, as he explains elsewhere, and as much of the Bible goes toward rightly detailing, our inability to maintain a state of moral perfection is very much an aspect of that curse, as well as being the curse itself, right? Every major religious tradition has, in one form or another, this aspect, in very different ways, of course, in the judicial sense, much in that of Western civilization, right? In Oriental civilizations, it's much to do with karmic cycles and the notion of karma. We touched a bit on that actually in previous weeks, in some of these earlier chapters, about this notion of the way in which good and evil are related to each other, not as equal but correlating, equal and correlating, but rather inversely related, right? That evil is but the absence of good, right? As darkness is but the absence of light, as chaos is but the absence of order, right? All these kinds of motifs that are very, very ancient, right? That's why we read about it in this kind of ancient literature. But understanding that relationship is imperative to understanding the broader framework of what's being addressed or what's being discussed. Those who are of, or belong to, or doing, in other words, those who are of the works of the law are under a curse for the reason of what he then quotes, right? Cursed is everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law to do them. Yeah? That specific reference is coming actually from Deuteronomy. Obviously, we're going through that on Sundays, right? At the moment, up in chapter 10. That specifically comes from Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 26, for those who take notes. So chapter 27, verse 26. And what God is addressing to the people there is that, again, where there is violation of the law, there will be justice, right? And part of this is not just merely administrative. We've also touched on this heavily on Sundays, right? Where the reality of judgment or of justice, I'm using those terms interchangeably just for now, is not strictly as a result of administration, right? In the sense of judicial, right? It is that, it's very much that, where immorality occurs, right? Where the violation of the divine law occurs, and then God acts in bringing justice against evil, right? There is that aspect, and obviously it's fundamental, but it is more than that, right? As in those motifs of darkness being the absence of light, evil being the absence of good, chaos the absence of order, etc., which are ingrained into this kind of ancient concept. Judgment or justice is the natural consequence of evil, okay? It demands it, right? It's why when we see injustice, especially if it's on a personal level, like an injustice committed against us or family or whoever it happens to be, there is a natural instinct, right, almost within the human spirit, to know that there is something wrong and to be continually grained and irked by that, especially if it prolongs that injustice, right? That natural instinct, again, is part of the way God has designed us, right? There is a natural realization of what is just and unjust, okay? And of course that can be warped, that gets warped all the time. However, the fundamental root of it can't be removed, right? Again, tying to that concept of conscience, which I spoke of earlier. But in this particular case, the reason why that is so is because there is a demand in the world for justice, right? And what I mean by that is metaphysically, okay? By nature, when evil occurs, there is almost a kind of cosmic demand by virtue of the way that God, who is the God of right and of justice, has designed things to work, okay? You read, for example, just to give you one particular example, where in these primordial writings of Cain and his murder of his brother Abel, right? And the language that gets used there is that the ground, right, cries out for the blood of Abel, right? It's a very poetic kind of way of phrasing it. What that is speaking of is this, again, the ground, the earth cries out for justice, right? The blood that was spilt upon it for the first time in this case, that then seeps down into the soil, right? There's this motif of creation itself, of the cosmos crying out for justice. There's a demand. And that's why, again, there's a whole host of implications, but some of the more historic English renderings of the Lord's Prayer, other than the ones that we're familiar with trespass, the other major one historically in English is debtors. Okay, so some people know it in English, going back centuries, as that phraseology, right? Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us. Okay, it's not speaking of finance, right? It's speaking of justice, right? The debt of justice. That's why we also use the phrase in English of when someone commits a crime that there is a debt to society. Okay, that kind of verbiage of debt. There is something that is owed by the criminal, by the lawbreaker, morally, legally, or otherwise. There is that which is owed not only to God but to life, to the world. Okay, and it is the very reason why, for life being taken, for murder, using the most extreme of examples again, the death penalty is instituted, right? Because the death of that person, the unjust, immoral taking of that life, demands the debt that is owed of it. And what is that debt? What is that which has been left behind? Well, a life, right? And so a life is demanded as the debt payment for the immoral evil of unjustly taking that life. There's this real sense of debt, right? Western civilization, Christian civilization has understood this, right, going back thousands of years, for these kinds of reasons. And not only us, again, it was a universally understood concept in the ancient world, okay? In the rare times in certain settings when murder did not bring the death penalty, it was seen as an injustice even among the pagans. Right? That's how ubiquitously this concept was understood. Right? I'm using that extreme example to point us to this notion of how this relates not just to ourselves individually, but at the largest of scales, talking about the world in which we live. Right? In the case of that quotation from Deuteronomy 27:26, again, to repeat it, he says, God speaking, cursed is he who does not confirm the words of this law by doing them. Okay? So there's this other aspect of this as well, where he, using that phraseology, confirms this word, in other words, affirms, by doing them. Okay? The actual upholding of the divine law, the moral law, that upholding is the confirmation in one's righteousness. Okay? So cause and effect. That's fairly obvious. In the context of why he's quoting it, referring to Paul down for us in Deuteronomy, is in relation to that notion of curse, right? Those who are doing works of the law in the attempt to be made righteous before God are under a curse because they cannot totally fulfill it. Because of the natural condition in which mankind finds itself, whereby we have an inability to perfectly uphold that law. He who does not perfectly uphold it will find that he cannot uphold it at all. There is a kind of totalizing aspect to this. It's either the totality or it's nothing. Right? Now, this is where, again, kind of like we talked about in other lessons, the stark difference that exists on this same fundamental concept between a Western understanding and an Eastern understanding. Okay, Eastern, Indian, all the way over the Orient, between a judicial understanding and a karmic understanding, as we call them, where, again, to oversimplify it for the sake of time, the karmic understanding, apart from the cyclical nature and reincarnation and other things which are another subject, there is a net value to that aspect of karmic cycles, right? And so the common way that people even today will still phrase that is by outweighing, right? remaining karmically positive, for example, right? There's this kind of economic language to it, right, in terms of a net positive. In the West, though, the difference is, by virtue of its Christian foundation, is that notion of debt, which I was talking about earlier, right? And again, we kind of think of this as unjust until it actually happens to us, okay? We think on the individual personal level very often of ourselves being good because we do good most of the time, right? Even if I blindly assume that that's true, okay? Because that's another question altogether. However, when a serious major injustice actually occurs, those ideas magically evaporate, okay? And we have this, again, ingrained into our justice system for that very good reason. When we, to keep going with the extreme examples of murder, when someone commits such a crime, what they've done throughout their life is utterly irrelevant to whether or not they're actually guilty of the crime of which they've been charged, okay? There are some aspects for certain crimes in which the life lived will impact sentencing, right? And certainly for minor crimes, that does impact things and should, in a sense at least, with regards to sentencing, right? But the guiltiness of whether or not one has committed the crime is not a pertinent factor at all, okay? How charitable one has been, how many community programs one has been engaged in, all the various things, how nice you've been to your neighbor, right? It doesn't really matter what level you're talking at. All of that life experience does not actually account for the debt that is now owed by virtue of the crime that you've committed. Even in allegedly victimless crimes, which again is a much more complex subject philosophically, but even in crimes like, say, what we would call white-collar crimes, like there's no physical violence involved, they say they're financial crimes or they're legal, fraud, etc. There is still, in a very deeply metaphysical sense, a debt that is owed with regard to that action, with regard to that illegality or that immorality, whatever it happens to be. And we know this. And so the debt that is owed cannot be accounted for, in other words, expunged, right, dealt with, handled, by other acts of moral good, as opposed to moral evils. Right? This is the kind of notion of what he's touching upon. Those who are of the works of the law are under a curse. Because even suppose that one maintained the majority, he has not maintained all. And cursed is everyone who does not abide by all the things written in this book of the law to do them. Emphasis on the word all. Okay. Again, Western civilization, Christian civilization, has understood this for thousands of years, and it's ingrained in the very fabric of our culture, right? And it's stood the test of time by virtue of its conformity to truth, right? It is in conformity with the natural order of the world, okay? Which again we understand even on an instinctual level, right? So that's why he's quoting that. So, verse 11. Now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident. Okay? He's pointing to something as, in fact, self-evident, right? If not even just evident, post priori as well. Okay? What he means to say here is that justified, we've spoken on this concept, right? Justice and righteousness are entirely synonymous. We have two different words for them in English. But when we speak of justice or righteousness, right, being right, kind of capital R in that sense, they're interchangeable, okay? So when he says now no one is justified or made righteous, no one is made just by the law before God is evident. And again, he gives another reason or another quotation to substantiate that. For, quote, the righteous shall live by faith. That ties into actually some of the things. We didn't look at that one specifically last week, right? But obviously much of what we looked at last week was from verse 6. Even if you just scan your eyes back up there. Just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. We looked at that in the context of those early chapters of the book of Genesis, right? Where through trusting in God, right? Again, reminding of how these words work, the semantics, faith, trust, confidence, belief, all four of those words in English are synonymous, right? So it's not a blind faith, it's not a faith that kind of is arbitrarily hoping that something happens off in the ether somewhere. It's a trust in every meaningful sense, right? That's why we have the English word confidence, right? From the Latin confide, con with fide, faith, okay? To have confidence, to have trust, okay, is to have faith, right? It's to in part C, right, there is obviously an unseen element, of course, right? No one here has seen Jesus Christ, right? However, we have read of those who did, right? So that's the confidence aspect, right? In this context, the righteous, the just, shall live by faith. Much like he did with verse 6 earlier on, we also looked last week, if you remember, at Romans 4, right, where the Apostle Paul actually quotes that again later on in his letter to the Romans. He does this with this particular verse, right? He uses this quotation here, which comes from the Old Testament, and he repeats it again in Romans chapter 1, right? So much of, at least in these elements, what he talks about to the Galatians, he also talks about to the Romans as well. Okay, so there's a number of crossovers, and we've already encountered one last week, and this is another one of that as well. Right? The righteous shall live by faith, in contrast to the law. Right? Not to say, and this is extremely important to understand, it's not really our focus here this morning, but it's just a basic elementary concept. It's not to say that by virtue of faith, the law is abandoned. In fact, elsewhere in his writings, he goes on to actually speak about that, or speak against that, I suppose, very directly by saying, what shall we do then? Again, he's asking a rhetorical question. Shall we go on sinning, right? Shall we go on breaking the law simply because God is gracious and loving toward us? Well, the answer is no, right? It's an abuse of that graciousness. It's an abuse of the love. And again, we understand these kinds of things, right? And we should. We fail to as human beings, but we should understand these things. It does not give us license to go forth and do what thou wilt, as would be the satanic motto. We have the liberty of being released from this curse of the law by the grace of God. We'll talk more about that later. And the liberty not to do what we want, but the liberty to do what is right. Okay? We were unable to do ultimately what is right prior to that. That is the curse. It's the essence of that curse, which mankind was so plagued with in the ancient world. But by the sacrifice of Christ and the grace of God that comes through that, we are freed from that curse, and we are now able to do what is right. Okay? We are able to live honestly. We are able to live righteously. Okay? We don't do it perfectly. However, when the righteous fall 7 times, they arise again. That's why there's that ancient proverb that kind of gives that little piece of wisdom. The ability to stand back up again and continue on the righteous path is something that is made not just merely true, but in fact able. Okay? And so the righteous shall live by faith, shall live by trust in God, okay, is what he's quoting there and reminding from those Old Testament texts. Verse 12, however, the law is not of faith. Okay? You can continually perform morally good works, either real or perceived, and have no element of trust in the actual lawgiver himself. Okay? There is no shortage of people in a general sense, even around the world, who by relative standards, and it is relative of course, but by relative standards, live fairly simple and on the whole, especially in the civic sense, morally palatable lives would be the way of just generically putting it. Okay, even again, if you just look among our own country, right? By definition, the vast majority of people are not criminals. Okay. Law enforcement is very much a frequent flyers club, right? It's why, generally speaking, any time that you see some major story in the news, half the time you can probably bet that the news reporter will say, and this individual was known to the police. Okay. By known to the police, what that means is they were in there last Tuesday. Probably for the same thing. Well over 80% of people who go in and out of any local area command station any given week have already been there before. Okay? It's well over 80%. It's about 82%. Last I checked. And so the repeat offender is something that's ingrained there, right? The reason why I'm drawing this point is that the majority of people do not actively go about breaking at least civic law. Okay? Obviously, that should be understood in contrast to what's being talked about here in regards to the moral law, the divine law. Okay, every one of us do break that. That it's part of the human condition as we know it. It is part of the human experience that is universal. Okay, And again, when we're honest with ourselves, we do know that. Like, we know that we have done at least one single immoral thing throughout our life. And then all the rest of them. Right? So part of it is about being honest. But in this particular case, what he's saying is the law is not of faith. It's not upheld by that faith, or they used to say by that trust in God. It's something additional to that. Okay? Hence, again, especially in light of what he just said about the righteous or the just shall live by faith. Rather, quote again, he who does them shall live by them. Right? So he who tries to live, and by live it means attain righteous, again, keep in mind what he's already been saying. He who attempts to live by the law, to gain his righteousness, his justice by the law, he who attempts to gain glory by the law, he who attempts to make himself right with God by doing moral works, in this particular case, must live by them. He who does them shall live by them. It's akin almost to a very, and that is a much, again, he's not the only one who said this, this is an ancient saying, but it's much akin to cause and effect, right? The curse itself almost becomes that you will live by the law. So the violation of the law is in itself bringing a curse, but the upkeeping of the law is itself the curse, right? It's almost a curse that begets itself. You will be enslaved, right? So there's this notion of shackling, right, in that kind of concept of a curse. It's why you find this language of redemption that is used in that term, which is exactly what he then speaks of in the very next sentence, right? Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. We'll get into the second half of that in a minute. But to stop off on that first part of that phrase, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. Okay? Redeemed. There is, and again, if you've been sitting in church for a while, you will have heard this, of course, but the notion of redemption has in itself an economic aspect, an economic motif. Of course, redemption, redeeming something. That's why, you know, in common settings today, of course, you redeem a gift card, for example, right? There is an exchange of value that occurs, right? The piece of plastic that costs 5 cents from China doesn't actually have the $100 in it, okay? It's redeemed for something, you exchange, right? There's an actual exchange of, there's a medium of exchange, and in this case, an exchange of value, right? In other settings, an exchange of meaning, but that's a different setting. In this case, an exchange of value. This much is given, and this much is returned. X, Y, Z, whatever it's there. In the case of what's being spoken of here, again, the redemption is in the context of slavery and of this curse kind of motif that's being spoken of. A redemption that occurs that purchases one out of, from underneath this curse. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. The debt, and again we're back to that language and why it's so important in the history of the English language, the debt that comes about in the world, in the universe, as a result of our immorality, as a result of evil, has been purchased, has been redeemed. Okay, that debt has been paid in that kind of more common parlance. Okay, and so hence why these ancient writers speak of Christ paying a price, right? This kind of sacrificial language and motif for that very specific reason, all wrapped up in this concept of redemption. Okay, something was paid and something was exchanged for that payment. Does that make sense? Yeah. In this case, life for life. The life of one for the life of many. Right? Now, generally speaking, that's not how that can occur or should occur. Right? It's a life for a life. Emphasis on the indefinite article a. Right? A life for a life. Right? Hence why with murder, the murderer shall pay the price of that life with his own life. Okay? Not the life of his entire family, but his life. Yeah? Even just on a very brief tangent, the most commonly misunderstood aspect of lex talionis, or an eye for an eye, this ancient concept of justice which goes back, 4,000 plus years at this point, is that it's seen as revenge, right? In that particular case. Eye for an eye, or lex talionis, is not a marker or a concept of personal revenge, right? It's of divine or legal vengeance, right? There's a very big difference between revenge and vengeance, even though they sound similar and have a similar etymological root, right? Revenge is on the individual level, it's the personal level, as well as it being born of passion or emotion, right? That's what drives revenge. That's why we look at terms like revenge killings, right? Vengeance is the due administration of that justice from the demand of that debt, okay? And the concept, ancient concept, coming through even the Bible and elsewhere, of lex talionis, as we know it in Latin, right? An eye for an eye. The law of retribution is that an eye is taken, therefore, an eye is taken from one, therefore the eye will be taken of the one who took it. Not the whole body, not the hand, not the foot, not the head, to keep that kind of symbolic motif going, but an eye, for an eye, right? There is an equality in the justice, okay? There is a proportionality, right? We don't and shouldn't put to death petty theft, okay? The poor man or the child who steals food from a grocery store should not be hanged in the public square, okay, as a general principle, right? There's a hierarchy of how justice is administered, commensurate to whatever the sin or the crime in this case happens to be, right? But in this particular case, the curse of the law is that of death. Okay? The curse is death itself. And this is tying back all the way into these ancient stories like that of Adam and Eve and of the garden, which is primarily what we're going to want to focus on for how that verse 13 ends, which I'll get into in just a minute. But death being, so that we can understand this concept to set this up for the ending of verse 13. Death itself is the ultimate justice for sin, for evil. I'm using those terms again interchangeably here. By virtue of not only the way in which they occur, so the kind of more pragmatic sense, but really based on its ontology, in other words, its nature. Okay, so it's something quite metaphysical in reality. It is the violation not only of the law itself, but by extension the lawgiver. Okay. Likewise, we have this concept ingrained into our justice system. I'll start there to then build us up to the level we need to be able to see this at, all right? When we come into like a serious judicial setting, a serious judicial scene. Of course, again, the way this has evolved and developed over time throughout the history of Britannic justice, of the common law system as we know it, which is unique to the British Isles and the Anglosphere, right? Similarly related to the civil law system of Europe more broadly, which is more Roman in aspect. But what you have is we're coming into a courtroom. There is a designated place of justice that again has shifted over time, but there is usually halls of justice these days, courtrooms as we call them. There is a defined order to where people are, right? The prosecution is on one side, the defense is on the other, okay, showing a clear division between the accused and the accuser, okay? If there's a personal aspect, of course, in this case, especially in the common law system, the Crown is actually the one doing the prosecuting on behalf of the individual. Sometimes even if an individual does not press charges, the Crown itself can actually press charges, which is also an act of justice in its own right because of that notion of debt that I was speaking of earlier. Even if I just pause there for 1 second, we have scenarios where an individual may choose not to press charges for XYZ crime, right? But if it reaches a certain criminal threshold, the Crown has no choice but to press charges. The reason why that's the case is because the debt that is owed to society by virtue of that injustice cannot be ultimately determined by the subjective opinion of the individual against whom the crime has been committed, right? There is a greater arbiter that extends beyond the individual, and that is the world itself, right? So the Crown actually, by default, has no choice. Once it gets to certain levels of criminality, I might as well use murder again for the half-dozenth time, right? Where if an individual, the family, in this case the family of the one who had been murdered, didn't want to press charges for murder because of some misguided sense of who knows what, it would be irrelevant, okay? The Crown would prosecute anyway, because the debt that is owed, cosmically, extends beyond the subjective whims of the person or the family or whatever it's to be. Circling back, prosecution, defence, okay? The Crown and the individual, right, who's against whom, who's been charged, right? There's a division, there is a clear outline, there's order. Of course, you have a judge presiding. These days, especially certain trials, you have juries. That's a development that comes ultimately out of Magna Carta and has been growing for 800 years and plus. What those meant at different times is a different subject altogether. But what you have, though, is the court itself that is actually a person, a type of personage, legal personage, not individual, but legal personage that exists. So you address the court. Right? Whenever the judge is speaking, everyone else is silent. The judge, even in our scenarios where you have jury trials, where really what the judge is doing is acting as the embodiment of the court and the arbiter of the law, capital L. Right? He becomes the embodiment of justice and the administration thereof. Right? The whole motif, especially in again the historic Christian common law system, is that the judge himself is actually standing in the place of God, right? As a kind of representative, right? Not that he is God, but as a representative of God. Right? He arbitrates the proceedings, okay, which is one of the big delineations between civil and common law systems in Europe, right? Between Europe and the British Isles. Where he is actually acting as an arbiter of justice itself and the various players, right? The defence, Crown Prosecutor at the QC, etc. Or in this case, the KC actually. Blah, blah, blah. The King's Counsel. And then ultimately, when the jury, if it's a jury trial, brings its finding, right? Guilty, not guilty. That is then pronounced and read formally through by the judge himself, especially when you had the death penalty still enacted up until relatively recently in our history. If someone was found guilty of murder, even before the sentencing had been done, because the sentencing was a different hearing, the judge, right, the jury finds guilty, the judge would then place a black cloth over his head, of course with judicial wigs, right? So the black representing death, representing justice, representing, right, all the motif that is tied in with the colour black, right? Sorrow, mournfulness, the colour of funeral. And he would then pronounce the judgment of the death penalty, right? You, blah, 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 have been found guilty of the crime of willful murder, and you shall be hanged by your neck until dead, right? That's before the sentencing has even occurred, because it might get downgraded to life in prison, right? But the actual ritual element of pronouncing that judgment is a demonstration of the judge as the very embodiment and arbiter of the law and of the demand for justice itself. Right? There's all this kind of very deeply symbolic meaning tied up in all of these things, work that has been building up for thousands and thousands of years. Right? That's why it's such a travesty when these things just get thrown out the window, as we often do with things in our day. But in this context here, how I'm building this up, the judge himself, right, is the embodiment of the law and of the court system, the judicial system. It's why, for example, you can be held in contempt. And this is what links us to the broader concept I'm wanting us to be able to see so that we can understand the ending of verse 13. Right? You can commit an offence against the court in the middle of the proceeding that has nothing to do with the actual crime itself. Right? You're in the middle of a murder trial, but you can have judicial misconduct, you can be held in contempt of court, right? Various other different phrases, again, terminology changes across different legal jurisdictions, right? But it's because there is an offence that can actually be committed against the lawgiver, in this case embodied by the judge and the court itself, that is an aspect, right? Zooming back out to the biggest level, because again, this is but a reflection in historic Western Christian culture of the divine reality of the world, right? The violation of the law, the divine law, the moral law, is in itself a violation of the lawgiver, right? And there's a metaphysical reason for this, right? A philosophical reason. The law of God and morality is not something that is separate or apart from God, okay, as if it was some other divine entity in and of its own self, right? There is actually an inherent intrinsic metaphysical link, right, an ontological link, as we would say, so by nature, that is, the being of, between the law and God himself. They are but an extension of his character, okay? Even to put it in fairly simple parlance, right, murder is wrong because God is the giver of life and the taker of life. And outside of authorized settings, no one, no matter who they are, from commoner to king, has the right to unjustly take life without rightful divine authority. Okay? God is the giver and taker of life. He is the one who gives life. He is the source of life. He is life itself, right? He is the fountain and wellspring of being and existence, and all things that have their being exist in, through, and by him. The very breath that we draw in our lungs at this very moment is but itself an extension of the divine life. Okay? Hence why that kind of terminology is used of us being made imago Dei, being made in the image of God. Right? This extends much more beyond us. It extends to all things, right? But God himself is the source of being, and everything that exists by virtue of having been created by him and maintained and sustained by him. Okay? To therefore take life without justification, in other words, without authority, is the more specific way of putting it, is a violation not just of that particular law written, but is in fact a violation of the source of being. It is a violation of God himself, right? And this just goes down the list on various other things. Again, lying, which is but the absence of truth. Again, there are positive lies and negative lies. We've spoken on this topic actually earlier on in this book of Deuteronomy, of Galatians, where if something is 99% true, it's 100% false. Okay, because something is either true or not true. It's a purely binary category, right? We speak of half-truths, which are complete lies. Okay? There's no such thing as something being mostly true as a legitimate moral category. It's either true or anything less than that is by definition a falsehood. And again, there are various different ways in which that can happen. Again, positive falsehoods and negative, so like lies of omission, we would say, or outright created lies, right? To do very different things. We've covered that in previous lessons. You'd be able to go back and find. But why is that immoral? Why is that evil? Why is that sinful? Because God himself is the very, not just the arbiter of truth, although he is truth. Okay? What he is reality. Right? He is truth. What he does defines what is real. What he does defines what is true. Right? It's why to violate the natural order, to go against the order that God has created in the world, is again itself to break with reality. Okay? It is to stand in opposition, in violation of that reality. Right? And all that exists there in that space is chaos. To break with that order, to abandon that order, leaves you in a realm without order, and that is chaos. Okay? It's a violation of the very being of God. All these things, up and down the board, in regards to morality, are born out of, like everything else, the nature and character of God. Okay, I'm using those terms interchangeably as well. There is technically a difference, but I'm just keeping it simple here. Okay? They're born out of the nature of who God is. To violate the moral law, the divine law, is a violation and offense of the divine being. It's to violate God himself, right? Philosophically and metaphysically, this has actually been very well understood, including even by the ancient Greeks to a degree. Even the ancient Greek philosophers understood this concept. They had limited ways in conceptualizing this, right? But it's why, again, it's why the Greeks were one of the first people to become Christian en masse, because in their culture, they had portions and parts of these concepts already pretty well ingrained over the course of what was easily the most well-developed philosophical culture in the ancient world, Right? It's why we still read to this day the Socratic philosophers and of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and various others. Right? They're part of the Western tradition by virtue of that. Right? This all then builds us up for understanding why we're under a curse. Okay? It is not only administrative, it's actually natural. To break and to violate the law of God is to violate the natural order. To violate order, to abandon, in other words, to break it down, is to leave you with the absence of order. And what is the absence of order? Chaos. Okay? You are cursed. You are cursed to chasing the horizon and never arriving. Right? It is, in many attempts, in many senses, the ancient story of Sisyphus, as he constantly pushes the rock up the mountain every day, only for it to then fall back down to the bottom. For him to then rise the next morning and to push the rock back up the mountain, almost reaching the top before day's end, and then the rock being cursed to fall back down the mountain, right? As he was cursed by the gods, cursed by Zeus in his ancient Greek story, right? The constant attempt. Now there's other motifs that are actually redeemable in Sisyphus, because he ends up taking gladness in the whole point of the story is he ends up taking gladness in the journey itself, and that's another concept altogether. But either way, the curse though is that Sisyphus is cursed by Zeus to push the rock up the mountain with the goal of getting to the top where he would be freed, but it then falls down at the end of the day when he's just this close to getting toward it, right? And this goes on forever. Right? That kind of ancient motif is very much along these kinds of lines, where you are cursed by virtue of a curse that you've placed upon yourself. To make yourself right with God, to walk through life, to live in the world by doing moral works and assuming that that makes you not just good on the individual level, but more importantly, good on the relative level, right? Good with God, okay? You are cursed to chasing and never arriving, because no matter what you end up doing, you will stumble and you will fall. And there are going to be instances in which you do not do morally righteous things every single day at every single moment. But again, we know this. But because there is this aspect of debt, of the violation of the law, because chaos demands an answer for the violation of order, we must answer for it. The problem is, though, we don't have a DeLorean in which we can jump back in time and resolve that thing. It's happened, okay? The murderer we call a murderer for the rest of their life. Now, of course, the grace of God can redeem them from that. It can cleanse them from that. No doubt. That's the whole point, right? That's what's so mind-bending when it comes to the kind of philosophy of it and the theology of it. The worst of evildoers can be redeemed by God from evil, right? And the grace of God is greater and more powerful than even the worst of evils that can be committed, okay? That has to do more with the nature of God himself. But either way, in this life, that person, again, it doesn't, in the world, mean that the evil didn't happen, right? The moral aspect of our record before God is wiped clean. We're made new in that sense, right? Kind of using that more symbolic terminology. But the actual act itself is something that is ingrained. That's why it's referred to as this curse, right? In this kind of language. And in this particular aspect, again, he uses this phrase once more, for it is written. Again, he's tying this back to things that have been written even in ancient times for him. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Now, this is where much of this content becomes much more deeply philosophical, right? So I'll do my best to walk us through what we need to understand here, right? But it's not unnecessarily so. It's rather by virtue of how these things are written and by how deep and profound they actually are on the conceptual level alone otherwise. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. This actually comes from elsewhere in Deuteronomy. believe it or not. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 21, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. Right? So Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23. What is said therein is as follows. If a man commits a sin, the judgment of which is death, right? So he does something that actually reaches the threshold of warranting the death penalty, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, right? So shall not. But you shall surely bury him on the same day, because cursed of God is he who is hanged. So that you do not make unclean your land, which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. Now, what's being said here? Very commonly in the ancient world, well, actually not just the ancient world, throughout most of history, and this is tied into the right application of justice, even though we get squeamish about it today for illegitimate reasons. Because of that notion it's understood, especially in the Christian context, of debt, right? Not only debt, but of debt being something that is an aspect of justice, which we were talking about earlier, right? A debt is owed to society, a debt is owed to the world, a debt is owed to God, right? There is a debt, there is something owing that is brought about as a result of evil or injustice. That must be publicly displayed and demonstrated, right? Secret justice, justice administered behind closed doors, is in itself an injustice, okay? Especially when in this kind of context. Again, keep in mind that verse 22 begins by saying, if a man has committed a sin and the judgment of which is death, okay? So it's not petty larceny, right? It's not he stole a chocolate bar from the corner store, okay? It's a serious crime. It's murder, it's rape, it's treason, it's etc., right? Serious, major public crimes, right? Justice must be seen publicly, okay? The people, capital P people, the people, right? The nation has a right as a people to see that justice is administered, to see that that debt is paid, okay? And so that's why executions were always public, okay? For that reason, okay? Not to be unnecessarily macabre, that was never the point, right? We live in a macabre world. We live in a world that is filled with brutality, right? In our modern Western sense, we are unprecedentedly shielded from it, okay? When we have wars, as we've had plenty in the last 100 years, they're on the other side of the planet, okay? Which in itself is part of the problem. That's a whole different subject, right? Because we're we're way too comfortable with sending our troops off to far-flung lands to get blown to pieces, because the most contact that we have with it is seeing very watered-down clips on the news at 6 p.m. vis-a-vis Vietnam, for example, or vis-a-vis Afghanistan, right? And those decisions become really easy when it's not on your doorstep, or more importantly, not right in front of you, right? That's a whole other political issue. But nevertheless, in this particular case, justice being administered publicly, right, in terms of death, right, serious major crimes, right, being administered publicly, was by virtue of the need, the human existential need for justice to be done, okay? This wasn't going to be secret, this wasn't going to be hidden, there wasn't going to be any veil of potential corruption or backroom dealing or sweeping it under the rug, which is always the risk that is run by hiding justice in that sense, right? And by keeping it behind closed doors and other such things, right? I'm not speaking of very unique, rare settings where things like closed courtrooms can be necessary. Sometimes that's the case, especially in regard to witnesses. That's a different issue. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the administration of justice against the criminal themselves. That's what I'm talking about, right? And so you would have public gallows, right? The person would be put to death publicly. Nothing would be hidden, right? Justice would be seen to be done, okay? As opposed to remaining under the black cloud of speculation that corruption had occurred, or that, like I said, backroom dealing and sweeping under the rug, those kinds of motifs that we use, had occurred here, right? Oh, he receives the death penalty. And we administered that justice and we put him to death. In reality, you sent him into exile and he's gone to live with wealthy relatives in the next city, right? And no one sees from him again thinking he's been put to death. No, everyone sees him get put to death, right? We know the crime occurred, especially if you think about tightly knit communities where the people know each other, right? And justice is seen to be done, not only by the people, right? But there's almost, again, in this, especially in this kind of symbolic sense, it's out in the open, right? It's a demonstration before God. We are following the law. Justice is being administered. The debt is being paid, etc., right? In this particular case of the wording of hanging on a tree or hanging, right? What does this mean? Looked different contextually depending on what you're talking about. Of course, in plenty of scenarios, it was the hanging from the tree was literally like hanging from the tree. Okay. Hanging from the tree could also often mean basically being tied to the tree. In fact, that is often how it occurred, at least in certain ancient Near Eastern contexts, where, for example, the body of the person who had been put to death for murder, for rape, for whatever, would be almost essentially kind of tied up to a pillar or to a wall of a major public building, a temple, a civic building, a palace, whatever it happens to be, right? Somewhere public, right? And would be tied up in that sense, right? So the actual cadaver or the body itself, propped up and then displayed publicly. The point is about the public display, not really the methodology itself, right? It obviously doesn't mean, especially in the days of Deuteronomy, it doesn't mean crucifixion. That hasn't been invented yet, okay? The proto form of crucifixion was invented by the Persians. The main form that we think of, obviously, was invented by the Romans, okay? Of dedicated, crossed-beamed wood, planks of wood, that you then are nailed to and raised up on. That's a Persian/Roman invention, right? However, though, the concept of the hanging on the tree is there for these kinds of rather powerful ways or powerful reasons, right? The issue is of the hanging on the tree. The literal wording that gets used is wood, right? But the imagery being drawn together is a tree. Now, the metaphysical aspect of what you need to be able to see here is this. The whole imagery of wood or of the tree, again, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably from now on, is tying all the way back into a very, very ancient motif that is not just part of the Bible, but is central to it, and is actually quite common, really common throughout even many of the pagan cultures of the ancient world, into the medieval world as well. Of the notion of the tree and its connection with the cosmos or the universe, okay? We're familiar with the kind of language from the early chapters of Genesis of the tree of life, for example, okay? Especially up here in the Blue Mountains. You've no doubt seen at one or multiple points the kind of imagery of a tree being used in New Age or occultic or mystical or pagan context, okay? This is tying into a very, very, very ancient motif that goes back to what is ultimately accounted in those early chapters of Genesis, okay? It's coming from the same source, right? By virtue of our common descent from Adam and Eve. This motif of the tree and its connection not just with life, but with the cosmic hierarchy of the world, from God all the way down to the world, is something which has multiplied and evolved across different cultures and iterations. Among the Europeans, especially those like the Germanic peoples, the Norse, etc., Yggdrasil, the world tree, right? In which the 9 realms in ancient and medieval Norse mythology were connected through the tree down to where we are of Midgard or Midgard, the middle world or the middle earth. Right? All the realms in which the Aesir and the Vanir and the various different gods lived, and all the other realms in Norse mythology, right? I don't expect you to know all this, but I'm just giving this as an image. All the different 9 realms in which the ice giants and Helheim, the realm of the dead, and other such places were all connected by a great tree. Okay? So this motif, even in pagan mythology, of the tree acting as a cosmic unifier that brings together all things, those pagan evolutions are drawing from actually what we have in Scripture, right? The problem is, at least in our time, we approach a lot of these things from a highly saturated, secular, atheistic, post-Enlightenment worldview, okay? It's one of the fundamental problems, not in totality, I don't mean in every way, I just mean in a certain respect, it's one of the problems with approaching the early chapters of Genesis through a scientific perspective. Not totally, I'm talking about in part, right? There is in part a problem with it, okay? The part of the problem is the fact that it's not, A, for starters, it's not written for that purpose. B, no one in the ancient world, including the ancient Israelites, or then even later on, the Greeks and the Romans and everyone else who's then reading those texts, would have read it that way. And when you have that scenario of it not being authored for that purpose and not being read for that purpose, you end up coming almost laterally into it with a different purpose. I use that term lens kind of figuratively, obviously, right? From which that departs from, I should say, the authorial intent and reception thereof that's designed into it, right? It's like reading a scientific, to use it in the opposite direction, it's like reading a scientific paper or a science textbook, for example, from the perspective or through the lens of a highly symbolic, poetic perspective, right? As if you're reading prose or poetry or narrative or whatever you want to do. You can't read that text that way either, because that's not how it's designed, right? And so you're going to be constantly coming out the other side of it with, to one degree or another, either in part or in full, erroneous conclusions, because you're misreading the very purpose and point of the text itself, okay? Those early chapters of Genesis are many things. They're historical. So history is definitely 100% an aspect of it. That's just not with that. That's without question. And the church has always understood that. However, in and amidst that history is also significant levels of figurative, symbolic language. Now, again, we've explained this, and this is something that modern Western Christians need to recapture. We had this, but we've lost it because of largely the effects of the Enlightenment and because of the rise of modern atheism and secularism through those schools of rationalism and empiricism that come out of the Enlightenment of the last couple of hundred years, right? Where today, when terms like symbolic or figurative get used, too often the assumption that comes back against that is that symbolic or figurative means not real.
Fantasy.
Yeah, fantasy. That's not what that means. It's never what that meant, it's not what it means now, and it's never what it will mean, okay? I've explained before that symbols are but windows of truth, meaning, and value, okay? They're mediums, not in the hocus pocus sense, but I just mean a medium like an avenue, right? They are a window of truth. They communicate something. The symbol itself is never the actual thing, okay? Right? The cross that one has on a pendant, the cross that one has on a ring, is not the cross that Jesus died on. Apart from the fact that he's not a miniature or a Lego toy, right? This is not the actual cross that he died on. Okay, this is a symbol of the one he did die on. Capiche? Yeah. That seems really obvious, but that's actually the point, right? So because we use cross symbolism all the time in Christianity, does that mean that the story of the cross is not real? If we have this ridiculous assumption that symbolic equals fantasy or not real? No, that would be a ludicrous conclusion, right? It represents and embodies the meaning, the truth, the value of the real thing, okay? It's why we've got to be careful when we talk about Holy Communion as symbolic and understand what that means, because it is highly symbolic. But symbolic doesn't mean that we're just doing an Anzac Day memorial where we're remembering something from the past and nothing's going on here and now. That's never how the church understood it. It's a really novel advent of the last 200 years. I point this out for this kind of reason, right? The early chapters of Genesis are drowning in symbolism, utterly drowning in symbolism, okay? However, what that means for us is, again, the way that has been designed, not just in the narrative form as it's being recounted by Moses, but the way in which God played that out in history, because it's also historical, right? Symbolism and history are not like kind of mutually contradictory. They often actually work directly in and of it, in together as itself, as God weaves that tapestry forward. But God designs and plays out that history to embody and imbibe and communicate throughout time, throughout history, those symbolic truths and values and meanings, okay? It happens over and over and over again. In this case, one of the most seminal of these is actually the structure of what's going on in regards to Eden and this whole notion of the tree, okay? Because keeping in mind, there's this seminal phrase we've got in front of us of cursed is everyone who hangs on the tree, right? Because we approach the early chapters of Genesis in very rationalist, empiricist forms of modern atheistic secularism, we miss the whole scene of what's going on. Most people fail to understand that Genesis 2, for example, very clearly demonstrates and articulates that the garden, which is in Eden, right? We call it the Garden of Eden for that reason. Eden is not the garden is in Eden. That's point one. But fail to understand or actually completely miss that Eden is a mountain. Okay? Because it doesn't say that Eden's a mountain, except for where it does. Right? You have in Eden a river that flows through it. And from there, from that river that is, 4 rivers flow out into all the world. Well, unless I need to explain year 7 physics, rivers flow downhill. It's a high point. Eden is the place from which 4 rivers flow from. It's elevated. Right? The early church universally and ubiquitously understood this. So many of the early church fathers wrote about this, right? St. Irenaeus, St. Ephraim the Syrian, the Cappadocian fathers, so St. Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, right? Over and over again. Or the early church wrote about this all the time. They literally universally understood that Eden was a mountain, right? As did even the older Israelite literature that comes kind of extra biblical, like the intertestamental writings that speak and touch on this concept, right? You've heard me talk many times before, as we've been going through Deuteronomy on Sundays, about the whole significance of mountains, okay? Again, the mountains in ancient cultures and ancient civilizations represented the place where the gods dwelt. Of course, really famous ones in Western civilization is that of Mount Olympus for the Greeks, okay? The Olympian gods, right? High up on the mountain is the place up there toward the heavens. That's where the gods are, right? It's why, again, Jerusalem and the old temple was built where? On Mount Zion, a mountain. Moses met God where? Mount Sinai. It's all mountains. Mountain. Right? Elijah defeats the prophets of Baal where? Mount Carmel. Okay? It's all mountains for that reason, right? These divine places, that's how they've understood it. It's why, again, do you think it's any coincidence, even faintly, that this place is the national capital of New Age mysticism and paganism, neo-paganism? No, because the mountains. That's the point. It's always been. That's nothing out of the ordinary. It's always been how it is, right? And that's because that is actually truth. Again, the pagan understandings are but the twisting and contorting of the truth itself. They're not just coming up with brand new things off the top of their head. Right? It never was that. Again, evil can't create things. Evil can only twist and contort the good. That's all it can do. Right? It has no property in and of itself. Right? Because by definition, it's a negative. Remember, evil is the absence of good. Darkness is the absence of light. It's not a positive. It has no positive property. Chaos, you don't build chaos, you break down order, right? And so the pagan understandings and the pagan stories they're the veiled, twisted, contorted images of the real thing, okay? The mountain, right? That's where the garden is. okay? And you have, again, because people don't slow down and read, people are of course familiar with the two trees. Tree of life, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, yes? But they miss the third tree, the fig tree. When Adam and Eve sin, what do? They make, yeah, exactly, they make loincloths to cover their shame, right? To cover the existential horror of that now they know evil because of their rebellion against God, right? They failed to do good, ergo they did evil, right? The absence of good. And they now knew the shame and the horror of that. And they were embarrassed to even stand truthfully before God. They needed to cover themselves and hide themselves from him. So they made clothes functionally out of fig leaves. There's the fig tree, okay? You've got the tree of life, tree of knowledge of good and evil, the fig tree. Now, this mountain that I'm speaking of, the reason why it's important for you to understand that those three trees, there's also actually a fourth, which I'll get onto in a minute. But at least inside, in the garden itself, there are the three trees of significance I'm talking about. That are the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of, like the fig tree, is itself a reflection that we actually see patterned throughout the rest of Scripture. Okay? In the tabernacle, right? And then later on in the temple, right? In the Old Testament. Okay? You have in its basic structure a tripartite hierarchy, or a tripartite structure, right? Meaning threefold. Okay? The holy place, or the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, we sometimes call it in English, right? The holy court, and then the outer court, right? So inner court, outer court. The holy court, inner court, outer court. Different ways of saying it in English, right? There's this threefold structure that's mirroring what you had in the garden, okay? Mirroring the place at the top of the mountain, as the early church conceptualized this and understood this, right? Where the tree of life stands, right? The source of eternal life, right? As that's playing out in that kind of story. You then have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which itself acts as a barrier to that tree of life, right? We know this because of what God says, right? You may have access to any tree, but do not eat of this tree, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? It stands as a barrier between that eternal life, because what would happen if they ate of that tree? They'd die. They would no longer have access to the tree of life, right? So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is like a veil to the tree of life, which is exactly what you have in the temple. A veil between, bless you, between the court and between the holy sanctum, right, the inner place, right, the holy sanctuary. There is a partition, a barrier that exists between that most holy place, place of life, the source of life, and that outside of it, right? That itself is the inner court, or the veil, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then that outer court, where sacrifice is made in the temple structure, right? Where sins are atoned for, where sins are covered, is emblemized by the fig tree. Because what do? They cover their shame, they cover their sins, okay? This tripartite structure is all there in Genesis. And again, the early church really understood that, right? We shy away from it because we like to think way too empirically, right? And we think like atheists. That's the problem, right? And so what happens is we remove any of this symbolic value because we're scared of it, even though all of our ancestors, up until 5 minutes ago, understood these concepts, okay? Because they communicate the truth of it, right? The way in which, additionally, the early church pictured this is almost, again, in that notion of the mountain. As you come down, this is where it's tying to this concept of the tree. You need to understand a bit more about why the tree is so significant, right? The reason why the scriptures, and why, again, even pagan cultures have had this essentially universal concept of the tree, as it's associated with life and with existence and with the cosmos itself, is because of the nature of what a tree is, okay? It's rooted, right? So there's a source, there's an origin to it, okay? Right, so there's a beginning, right? It's grounded there, and that's where it's fed. That's where it's obviously the nutrients coming through the soil. It is the source of the life of that tree, okay? And this is tied to the divine aspect. But nevertheless, there is a unity. There is the trunk, There is a oneness, a unity to that tree. Okay, and this is obviously reflecting the unity of God. From there, you get branches. There is a multiplication. It's why that kind of language, by the way, again, a very, very ancient saying, be fruitful and multiply, features there in that account. Okay, being fruitful, tied to that notion of the tree, and multiplying is exactly what the tree itself actually does. Right? So you branch off, and what is the branch? Again, thinking in terms of the metaphysical, the symbolism of it. It's in itself another little miniature tree. Right? It's the same substance, it's the wood, the exact same material. But it branches off, and from that branch you have smaller branches, which is just in itself a smaller form of the big tree as it stands anyway. The unity multiplying into many. The branch is the next unity multiplying into the many, and twigs, and we go all the way down, right? That's why you have this symbolism, okay? Of course, their height and their spanning up into the heavens has been universally understood in the ancient world and the medieval world until very recently, okay? And so the tree of life is itself reflecting that kind of very deeply symbolic kind of metaphysical value of what a tree is, all born out of the way in which God himself operates. We are made in the image of God, in the likeness of God. We are but the branch to his trunk. We are of the same reflection and material, right? We're not just merely material things, we are also spiritual, right? And that spiritual aspect, that spiritual reality, is itself from God. It doesn't exist outside of God. It's not something additional to God. It's not like there's God and then this other spiritual substance which he made us from, okay? It comes from him, and that's why that language is used of being made in the image of God, okay? It's unique to us, that spiritual aspect, okay? Obviously, the various order of animals have greatly varying levels of sentience, for lack of a better word, from more intelligent creatures like dolphins and ravens, all the way down to functional robots and automatons like ants, which in no sense think at all. They act purely based on chemicals and pheromones, right? That's a different aspect, right? There's no abstract reality to that. There's no spiritual nature to that, right? We as human beings are the only ones who possess that. It's what classifies us as unique in the world. Okay? But it's all sourced in and through God, right? It's not some different spiritual nature, right? It doesn't mean that we are God, right? That's a different categorization altogether. But the spiritual nature is not some different kind of spirit to that of God himself in that respect, right? There's not multiple different kinds of spiritual things, right, that God has. It's why, again, keeping in mind is that terminology of the pagan distortions, it's why you have notions of universal spiritual realities in a lot of the Eastern religions, for example, okay? Like pantheism being really obvious forms of this, like in Buddhism, or its variants in Hinduism, for example, right? Of everything being part of the one cosmic universal spirit, that kind of Eastern, especially Buddhist concept, is but the pagan perversion of the real spiritual relation and how that actually works in order, right? It doesn't pop out of nowhere, right? It's a distortion of the reality, okay? So it's not some far-flung thing, right? For these kinds of reasons, the story that prevails through the garden is very much tied to this concept of the tree, right? The unity of God bringing about multiplicity after its own likeness. It's why Christ then again later on says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Right? He's using this kind of terminology, okay? Part of that is also then tied as well to the nature of water. Again, we spoke earlier, the reason why we know Eden was a mountain was because the rivers flow from it, okay? But another important aspect you need to see here of how human beings, including in the scriptures, again, this actually comes up a lot of times in the Bible, quite frequently, water, okay? Very, very often, in fact. Equally, if not actually really probably more so than that of the tree, does this concept come up in the ancient scriptures. And it starts with the garden, okay? There is a constant contrast between what today I suppose we would call fresh water and salt water, right? In the ancient way that they would word it, they would call it sweet and bitter. Okay, so bitter waters, it just means salty, right? Sweet water means, drink fresh, drinkable, right? It's not bitter, okay? That's what that is. So when you read sweet or bitter water in the Bible, that's what it's talking about. By the way, fresh or salt water, okay? Now, the water flowing from and through Eden, again, there's 4, by the way. You get 4 rivers that flow out, symbolizing the 4 corners of the world. We actually just spoke about that concept a couple of weeks ago on Sunday when we were talking about these imperial titles that were used in the ancient world, right? The ancient kings of Babylon and Arcadia, who would call themselves the king of the 4 corners of the world, right? The king of the universe, the king of all, right? These kinds of grandiose titles that were stealing from that of God. The 4 corners of the world. The 4 rivers are flowing out to the corners of the world. It's showing the world. That's the whole imagery that's tied in there. In this particular case, it's fresh water, right? It's drinkable. It's living water, right? Which is also, again, if you ever see that term living water, what that means is that sweet, like drinkable water, fresh water, right? We can't drink salt water or bitter water, right? If you're lost at sea, the last thing you want to do is drink. It's one of the great ironies, right? Surrounded by water you can't drink. Part of the reason, by the way, in which the oceans, right, were always universally, including in the Bible, understood to represent chaos. I think I've spoken about that actually a couple of times, right? The land in the ancient world represented order, stability, right? Because it's there, it's solid, it doesn't move. The waters represented chaos, constantly in a state of flux, right? Constantly moving, right? Where fearsome creatures of the deep dwelt, yep, and everything else, where you faced storm and peril, and where you can't live. Now we've, in many respects now, mastered the waves, right? To the point where you can, right? That actually ties into the motifs of the anthem "Rule Britannia." Britannia rule the waves. Britain never shall be slaves. This command to rule the waves was about taking dominion over chaos, but that's another issue. The point being is that why I'm saying this is that again you can't drink bitter waters. It doesn't bring life. It actually, ironically, will kill you because it'll dehydrate you with the salt count due to the salination. So the living water is the fresh water. Okay, right? Why am I pointing this out? Understand that in the physical side, fresh water is always elevated in one form or another. Okay, water, even if it's groundwater, eventually flows downhill into the sea, right? Where it intermixes and becomes one with the salt water, right? Which then evaporates, goes into the clouds above, high, elevated, goes into the heavens, where again, due to chemical processes, then falls down as what? Not salt water, fresh water. And the cycle begins again, right? It falls down the mountains, the elevated places, right? It doesn't have to be giant mountains, but you know what I mean? The mountains, the elevated places, and then flows downhill to the place of the bitter waters and then raises up where it's transformed into living water, right? So the rain has always been seen as a blessing, right? That's why it was such a curse with regards to the whole story of the flood, because it was an inversion of the whole motif. It was an inversion of the whole concept. Water, rains, were a sign of blessing, but now, because of the great evils of the people, it had been turned into a curse, right? That's the whole, it's by design that occurs, right? And it's also why God says he'll never do that again, right? Because it was an complete and utter reversal of the natural way of things. The rains were a blessing, right? Rain brings life. It waters the ground, it grows the plants, right? It brings nutrition to the crops, right? Animals, us, we literally need fresh water to survive, to live. It's all symbols of blessing. The rains are a symbol of blessing, okay? Which is why Christ himself says to the woman at the Samaritan well, this water, at this famous well of Jacob, this ancient well, you drink it and you'll be thirsty again. However, those who follow me, From him shall spring forth what? Living water that will bring eternal life. Well, it's interesting because flowing through the very same garden where the tree of life that brought eternal life was what? Rivers of living water. He's actually hearkening back to Genesis, right? Okay. Now, we've been building up these concepts, right? The tree, fresh water, you need to understand this. Okay, life, the tree of life. On the mountain, the holy place, the divine place, up where the gods are. In this case, God himself. Okay, the temple, right? It's a garden temple. It's cultivated. Man is at work. He's in communion with God. There is a barrier around it, right? As we know, of course, because when they get exiled, right? One of the guardians then stands there with a flaming sword at the wall, at the barrier of the garden, right? There is an actual defined place. It's not like the garden just spreads out as far as one can see. There is a defined place of where the garden is and then where the garden ends, right? They get exiled from it out into the wilderness, okay? Beyond that garden was wild, untamed land, right? The whole world was good. There was an inherent goodness to the world, right? But there's a distinction between wild, the wilderness, and the dominion. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay? That's the whole, be fruitful and multiply and take dominion. Okay? And so then what do? They go forth and they take dominion in the wild parts of the world. But they've been exiled, they've been cut off from God. That's the whole part of the story. Now, we come all the way forward through the course of thousands of years. And the concourse of history arrives us at another mountain, Golgotha. The hill of the mountain of the skull, as that name means. Okay? In other words, the hill of death. Okay? It's another mountain, but it's not a mountain of life. It's actually the opposite. It's a mountain of death. Okay? And on top of that mountain, you have what? 3 people, 3 trees, once again. Okay? 3 crosses, right? Wood, tree, interchangeable here. Okay? Now, what's going on in that scene? Okay? That you have to be able to see and connect back to all these motifs. Again, what you have going on in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is a replaying and a recapitulation of Genesis 3. 2 by extension, but you get the point, Genesis 3. Okay? Complete replaying of Genesis 3 with slight inversions. Okay? You have Christ on the cross, on the tree that brings life, because through his death, life comes. Right? By his wounds we are healed. Right? By his death, he brings death to death. He crucifies it, he defeats it, he conquers death. And through his resurrection, all those who trust in the sacrifice that he made receive the grace of God and receive eternal life. Right? You have the tree of life firmly in the middle, and you have one to his left and one to his right. You have to the right the thief, as we know him, we call him the good thief in Christian terminology, right? But you have the one who recognizes that Christ is the Son of God, he is God in the flesh, and calls on him to remember him when he comes into paradise. Okay? You have the good, right? Made good, right, through repentance, right? Made good through faith. Literally, he has faith in his dying moments, right? To the right of Christ, you have the good. To the left of him, you have the other thief who mocks him, who slanders him, who curses him. You have the good and you have the evil. You have the tree of the good and the evil. Tree of life, tree of good and evil. Okay? Right there where they're being crucified, just outside the city, they are right nearby another tree. A tree that Jesus actually cursed on his way into Jerusalem in the final week. The easy part of the story to miss, because it's a very brief scene. It doesn't occur quickly. Right? They're in Jerusalem, right? In and around Jerusalem, right? On their way to it. And Jesus stops with the disciples in the middle of the road, and he turns and he curses a fig tree. He condemns it and says, "From you fruit shall never spring forth again." Okay, now there's two things going on there. His disciples are bewildered and they say, what are you doing? And they don't understand what's going on. He turns and says to Peter and the rest, "If you have faith that even this mountain can be picked up and thrown into the sea, so it shall happen." Right? And that seems very like cryptic and esoteric and what's going on there. There's two layers of things going on. Okay, one is it's a curse upon Jerusalem itself. Right? The fig tree, because of its association all the way back with Genesis 3, was one of the most common symbols or motifs of the Israelites and of the Jews by extension in the Old Testament. Okay, so the fig tree was much like what the cedar tree was and even is to this day to Lebanon, for example. Right? If you look on the Lebanese flag, there's a big cedar tree, right? Because Lebanon, Phoenicia is famous for its cedar trees. The famous English oak, various different trees that are familiar and become kind of national symbols. The fig tree was one of those national symbols, right? For the Israelites and the Jews in the Old Testament. He curses the fig tree, and the mountain he's talking for, again, keeping in mind, he's standing right in front of Jerusalem, Mount Zion, right? One of the very last things he does is pronounce judgment on Jerusalem just before the Olivet Discourse, right? So like Matthew 21, 22, 23, right? Where he pronounces judgment. "Woe, woe, Jerusalem, the city that murders the prophets that are sent to it," right? From your head I shall demand all the righteous blood from Abel to Zechariah, which is like thousands of years of history, right? Abel as in like Canaan Abel, all the way down to Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist who'd been killed. So all of this bloodshed, all the men who had been sent by God to guide them, to instruct them, who they constantly, like more often than not, literally straight up murdered, right? And he pronounces judgment. So casting this mountain into the sea, the chaos, judgment, the curse of Jerusalem, right? Of course, 40 years later, just like he said, Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple brought to ruin, because now the new temple is the people, right? The temple of the living God. That aside, there's also actually something much deeper there, and it's tying into this whole motive that ties into Golgotha, which is nearby where this fig tree is that the fig tree was used to do what, like we talked about earlier, cover their shame, cover their sin, right? He curses the fig tree and says, "Never from you again shall fruit spring forth." Okay? It's actually a redemptive. At the same time that he's cursing the evil and the sins of Jerusalem and of the people, he's actually also condemning and cursing evil itself, right? "Never from you shall spring forth fruit again." Okay? The fig tree, which represented, in the almost literal sense, the covering of shame and of sin and of evil, okay? It represented the evil because it was brought about, again, they covered themselves with fig leaves once they knew that they'd committed an evil act, right? So its association with evil was really obvious. He curses it. He curses the curse of evil, right? It's almost like he curses the curse, right? And so, tree of life that Christ is upon, surrounded by the tree of good and evil itself, right? The good thief, the bad thief, representing and playing that part. Outside the city where the fig tree itself was, and then that fourth tree that I haven't yet mentioned but I told you would come last, right? It's the fourth tree that gets missed. It's the thorn bush that comes about at the end of the story in Genesis 3, right? It is the symbol of the curse, more so even than the fig tree. The fig tree just represents it, right? It itself was part of the curse, right? "From the ground, thorns and thistles shall come forth on your behalf." Right? A visible reminder, okay? But keeping in mind, that's occurring right there, okay? Now again, the way that the early church understood this and the ancient Christians understood this is that the thorn tree was around that barrier of the garden, the walls of the garden, right? Because keeping in mind, there were literal gates and barriers. That's where the guardian angel stands with the flaming sword, right? In that story, which that's a whole other symbolism to do with him, but that's a different kettle of fish. And so the thorn trees are around that, around the mountain. Crown of thorns. Now, the final part of that thorn bush, again, where does Moses meet God? He meets God at Mount Sinai, okay, when he's over in what today we call the Arabian Peninsula. God calls out to him. Again, God calls Moses, not the other way around. God calls Abraham, not the other way around. But he calls Moses, beckons him to where? To come, yeah. And ultimately, again, at the foot of the mountain. It's where this is occurring, okay? Again, it's there when you understand it doesn't say it specifically, but it's there when you understand the geographical scene of what's going on here, okay? And he calls out to him from in the midst of a burning bush. Now, I won't bore you with the etymology because that's a more complex subject of the word. But the word that is used there is the standard, basic, common word for thorn bush. Okay? Fire is associated with God. Again, we tend to think of fire in relation to hell because there is some, and judgment because there is that image, right? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah being one of those examples. Okay? And so the fire that destroys has a very vivid motif for human beings, right? Especially if you've ever had, the unfortunate position of having one's house burnt down, or seeing something like that. But in this particular case, burning also needs to be understood that the same fire that destroys is also the same fire that refines, right? Like say with metalwork and metallurgy, right? You refine gold through fire and stuff like this, right? The fire that can destroy is also the same fire that refines, and it's why you find this used again as another motif, okay, throughout the scriptures. And this is what I'm building us up to being understand of the final tree, which is the thorn bush, okay? In the case of Isaiah chapter 6, right, when Isaiah is shown this great heavenly temple, what does the guardian angel do? He brings over a burning coal, fire, right? We don't have time to talk about that, but they themselves, these peculiar angelic figures, are also again described as using a word saraf, which means a fiery flying serpent. Okay? It's this draconic imagery. I actually talked about this last Easter, so you can go back and look at that if you want to, when we talked about the bronze serpent, which ties into this, by the way, because the serpent is put up on what? A pole, a tree. Anyway, by the way, circling back to the burning bush, the fire, which is of God, again, it's not fire that destroys, it's fire that refines. It's why in the medieval world, Europeans would commonly refer to heaven as empyreon, so from the Latin, but from ultimately the Greek pyros, meaning fire, right? So empyreon, the realm of fire, or the place of fire, okay? Fire associated with heat, fire associated with life, therefore, right? It's why, again, the fire that can also destroy is also actually a source of life. In the winter, in the cold, out in the wilderness, you build a fire, right, to preserve life. This burning bush is occurring, right? God is, again, speaking through this in this very odd way, almost mystical way. But the fire doesn't consume the bush. It doesn't burn it, right? And again, this is all occurring. This is all happening in history. This is a real historical event, but is deeply symbolic by design. Do you understand? Again, they're not contradictory things. You have to understand the history and the symbolism are actually unified. They go together, okay? And God designs it this way to communicate these incredible values, right? He calls to Moses through the burning bush, through the thorn bush. And so God's presence in the thorn bush, which represents sin, literally the curse of sin, that's the whole point going back to Genesis 3, his presence doesn't destroy it. Okay? The whole reason why they were exiled from the garden was because they could no longer stand before God because of their evil, because of the curse. They were no longer worthy, and it would destroy them if they did. The purity, the holiness, the righteousness of God was too much for mankind to now bear. We had been in communion with God, we'd been in connection with God, but by our own hand, we'd severed that. And the thorn bush, which literally acted as the barrier to the garden, in this kind of conceptualized understanding, now severed us, and it stood as the symbol for all time as to that judgment. However, with Moses, this image of redemption is starting to build. God's presence is in the burning thorn bush, but it's not consumed, it's not destroyed. Right? You fast forward, and the thorn bush, again, thorn bushes aren't giant things, right? They're not like the big trees, they're bushes, right? They're down low, they're at the ground level. They're not up high, elevated toward the heavens where God is, they're down at our feet, right? How does he curse the serpent? On your belly of the ground you shall go all the days of your life, and you shall eat the dust of the earth. Very misunderstood phrase for understandable reasons, right? It has nothing to do with a lizard losing its legs, okay? Not even faintly at all, okay? In fact, again, the serpent there, who later on is revealed to be Satan himself, is not a brown snake. It's not what's going on there at all. That's a different, more complex subject. Going on your belly of the earth, like going on your belly along the earth, eating the dust of the earth, which is what that phrase is that's used there, is actually a very, was even at that point, an extremely ancient phrase, okay, of a curse. In the Babylonian mythologies, which have this play out between the god Marduk, the national god of Babylon, and Tiamat, a dragon goddess, a chaos serpent, in this very ancient literature, which is being written in and around the same kind of times, like 3,500, 4,000 years ago from our point now. Tiamat is cursed when Marduk defeats her to crawl along the ground all the days of her life and to eat the dust of the earth. How does that play out in that story? She's cast into the underworld. Okay? This is what's being done. This being, Satan, who was at the highest of the heights, is cast down from the holy place into the underworld, beneath even the feet of mankind, lower than the place that man had fallen to. Hence why Christ says it. Behold, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. He's cursed to the lowest place in the cosmos. He's cursed. He wanted to ascend and he wanted to become God. He wanted to overthrow God, but instead was cursed to the lowest part and the lowest place, down where the thorn bush is, right? Down here on the ground at our feet. Around the mountain, this barrier of thorns, thorn bushes that now spring up, right, as the vivid sign of the curse, is actually lifted up and placed where? At the top. The symbol of the curse upon mankind is elevated and placed at the capital, literally capus from the Latin head, right? That's where we get the term capital punishment from, right? Okay? We refer to a capital city, right? The head city, the main city, right? Capitus, head, right? The top, the chief, in other words, in Latin. It's brought up and raised back up and placed as a crown of thorns on the crown of the head of God himself. And it's through that redemption comes. The curse is lifted, literally, elevated back up to the top of the divine place, Christ's own head, and through his death and the blood and the piercing, the curse is redeemed. The final piece of the puzzle ties us all the way back into all these things. Right? And the final most part is this. The crucifixion ends with, into your hands I commit my spirit. He dies. The Roman centurion takes his phalanx, he takes his spear, pierces his side, flows forth blood and water. Right? The blood of sacrifice and the water that brings life, intermingled. It is also, again, a medical thing that actually medically happens, right? Due to various things that occur when the heart stops, and the way in which fluid then rises to the surface of the skin and other such things. Right? So there's actual little biological, medical function to that. But again, the symbolism is being worked through the biology or the material stuff. River of water, right? And of course, splashes down the centurion. It is in itself a baptism. That's what it's symbolizing. Right? The water now purifies. Right? From him flows rivers of living water. The same living water that flowed forward from the temple. They're up on a mountain that was the place of death, in contrast to the place of life, right? The Garden of Eden, or the Garden in Eden in this case, right? But the Garden of Eden, right? It had been turned into a mountain of death because of our corruption, because of our evil, because of the great evils of mankind which we read of in the ancient world. And there stood all the same players. The tree of life, which Christ himself hung on, because he became a curse for us, because cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. To pay our debt. The debt that is owed, the demand of justice. Right? The tree of the life of good and evil, symbolized by the good on the tree and the evil on the tree. Right? Outside the city where the fig tree was, that he'd already cursed on his way through, right? In cursing the curse itself. And then the final tree of the thorn tree, the very symbol of the curse, which actually was part of the curse itself, is raised from the lowest part down at the earth up and placed back up at the top. It's redeemed and now becomes a crown of not curse, but a crown of glory. All playing out through history, thousands and thousands of years, right? It's why the early church developed a tradition, and it wasn't like a binding belief, but a tradition that the same wood from the cross of Christ was actually the same wood that was part of the staff of Moses, and the staff of Moses was of the same wood that was part of the tree of life. Again, it was never a binding belief, it was just a tradition, right? But the reason why that belief kind of started to come about was because of these same kinds of motifs. I mean, even if I speak of the staff of Moses, you see this concept playing out even in things like the Exodus. Again, the waters of chaos, the waters of death, literally, because they were trapped, right? In these cases was parted by Moses doing what? Taking his staff and planting it into the earth, and it separated the waters and provided dry land, right? A path of redemption forward, right? So you have these kinds of images and motifs, and that is already tying back to the same guy who had this encounter with a burning thorn bush anyway. Do you know what I mean? So all these elements of water and the tree and the thorn bush, and it's all playing out in these kinds of things. Again, and then the staff, that is to say with the bronze serpent, right, is again this serpentine imagery, a symbol of cursing and of darkness and of evil, being lifted up and placed on a pole, on a tree, right? All this kind of imagery is there because it's the motifs playing out throughout history, right? And so then now for us, the place that was the mountain of death has become a mountain of life, right? It's through the cross on the mountain of death, the mountain of Calvary, right? The hill of Golgotha, through which and by which life now comes to us. So the mountain of death is redeemed, and it becomes for us a mountain of life, right? The tree of life. And that's why you get all the way to the end of Revelation, and you have, again, the same symbolism playing out, right? The tree of life is in the midst of the city of God. It's not a physical tree. The whole point when you get to Revelation 21, 22 there, the tree of life that is in view is Christ himself. He is the tree of life. He is that tree of life. That's how that's playing out there, especially by the time you get to Revelation. All these things are tied into this whole notion. Again, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. The criminal, right? The one who's cursed to be publicly displayed as dead for his crimes, right? All these kinds of things. It's tying back into this whole notion of curse and of the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the temple structure, all the things we've covered here today, right? And that's why he finishes finally by saying for us in verse 14, in order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the nations, so that we would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. All this was to bring about the redemption of his people throughout the world. There you go.
Very good. Thank you. Got lots to digest.
Yeah. Janine's like, yeah. I'm like, yeah.
And ironically, Hollywood invented a new tree. The tree of the apples.
Oh,
The apple tree, I suppose.
The tree of the apples.
Yes, sir.
Oh.
Anyway, that's it.